Today's episode features 3 stories of police officers encountering strange and unexplainable things on their patrols. But before we begin, if you enjoy narrations of various mysterious and strange stories, then I would appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to the channel. With that being said, let's get into it. Paranormal emergency. This story is just one example of a scary phenomenon often reported by paramedics. But this time, we follow 2 police officers who encounter the same thing. A police department in London received an emergency call. The woman who had called claimed that a person had broken into their home and had killed her husband. Upon forcefully entering the house, her husband had tried to confront the robber, who then shot him. Luckily, one police cruiser was patrolling an area not far from this crime scene. On top of that, an ambulance was called, in hopes of somehow saving the wounded man. Just 3 minutes after receiving the call, the police cruiser arrived at the scene. In it, a very experienced police officer and a young female officer. The following story is based on the official report later submitted by the older male officer, a man with years of experience in the field. According to his report, upon arriving at the scene, they exited their vehicle and approached the house. They went up the stairs and finally reached the broken door. Inside, they already heard the cries of a woman, so they announced their arrival and entered the apartment. Upon entering the apartment, they came face to face with a man wearing a red training suit. The man greeted them casually, and since the officers were told that the robber had already left, they ignored the man. However, when they entered the living room, their hearts stopped for a moment. Lying on the floor was a man with a deadly bullet wound. Next to him, the crying woman who had called emergency services. The dead man wore a red training suit and looked exactly the same as the man they had just encountered in the apartment's hallway. The female officer immediately sprinted out of the apartment, hoping to find the man, while the other officer tried to give CPR. The woman was shocked by the whole situation, and luckily the paramedics arrived just minutes later. The strange man was nowhere to be found. Neither the female officer nor the paramedics running up the stairs had encountered anyone. After her husband was transported away, the officers sat down with the woman and asked her what had happened. She repeated the same story from before, and when asked if anyone else had been in the apartment at the time of the robbery, she said no. It was also unlikely that the officers had encountered the robber leaving the apartment. After all, while calling the police, the woman had already stated that the man had left, and according to her testimony, the robber wore dark camo clothes and was taller than her deceased husband, so a mix-up would make no sense. The officers obviously didn't know what to do with this experience. When they filed the report, they only wrote that they had encountered a strange man who was wearing the exact same clothes and looked very similar to the recently deceased victim. From their statements, it almost looks like they had encountered the spirit of the recently deceased husband, and, like I already hinted, this phenomenon is something reported relatively often, especially by paramedics. These reports always follow the same structure. A paramedic arrives at the scene of an accident or a crime scene, and this is where they encounter a person who looks basically exactly the same as the dead person right in front of them. For example, following a fatal car crash, they see an exact copy of the recently deceased victim just lingering near the crime scene. In all those cases, this strange person would quickly vanish without leaving any trace behind. In those confusing moments, some paramedics come to the only conclusion they can think of, being that they had just encountered the spirit of a recently deceased person. And this is exactly what had happened to these two police officers. Of course, every time such a story surfaces, there are skeptics who claim that these paramedics mixed something up, or that there just happened to be a similar-looking person at the scene. And I would definitely agree with this notion if we were talking about one or two cases. But apparently we are talking about cases numbering in the hundreds. It doesn't matter how we attempt to explain these reports. The possible explanations remain kinda strange, no matter if we believe in ghosts of the recently deceased, a psychological phenomenon triggered by encountering horrific scenes, or just a number of coincidences where a clone of a recently deceased person just happened to be there at the same time. But I will let you decide what you think about this case. The Old House. This case took place in a small town called Montmeyran, located in southern France. Only about 3,000 people live in this old town, and it's a tightly knit community. Besides a small hotel and some local shops, there is not much to find in this town. The combination of not much going on around there and the fact that everyone knows each other results in a crime rate of basically 0. On a normal day, the local police officers would drive around town or sit inside the police station without any disturbances. This is what makes this specific case so strange. One day, an old woman living in the town passed away. Since the woman lacked any heirs and was considered to be rather rude, her house was basically abandoned following her death. Over time, her former property deteriorated and became a meeting spot for teenagers who wanted to party. At some point, the major had it boarded up because he was afraid that someone would get hurt inside the old house. Following this decision, it became routine for the police officers to check on this house every single night, just to make sure that no one entered the now prohibited area. It was on one of these patrols that something really strange happened. Out of nowhere, a group of teenagers basically jumped in front of their vehicle. They seemed to be in a panic and were obviously running away from something. The two officers exited their vehicle and talked to this group. Without any hesitation, and despite knowing that it was illegal, they admitted that they had been inside this old house. They just wanted to relax there when out of nowhere an old scary woman appeared and began to scream at them, repeatedly saying that they should leave her house right now. Then the woman supposedly vanished and manifested behind them, where she continued her screaming. Following that encounter, they all fled the scene, and that's when they encountered the officers. The partner of the reporting officer didn't believe them and asked them if they had taken any drugs. However, they swore that they hadn't consumed any drugs or even alcohol, and since the officers knew these boys, they believed them. Although this meant that they would now have to check out this house to make sure everything was in order. They split up, and while his partner checked out the backyard, the reporting officer entered through the front door with a key they always had with them. Holding his flashlight, he began to search every room and found nothing suspicious. Until he came across a room with an open door. When he approached his door, an old, scary lady came out of the room and began screaming at him to leave her house. The officer was obviously shocked and dropped his flashlight. His blood froze when he realized that this woman closely resembled the house's former owner. He had known the woman prior to her death and was convinced that it was her. There was only one problem. This woman was supposed to be dead. This officer was actually at the scene when her body had been transported following her death. During all of this, the woman kept screaming and followed the officer as he slowly made his way back to the front door. He then left the house and ran into this partner, who asked him what had happened. At this moment, the officer realized how crazy this whole story would sound and decided not to share what he had experienced. Instead, he just told his partner that he felt a bit sick, and they both returned to the police station. Due to that decision, this case cannot be found in official reports, and the officer only made it public later on a forum where officers can share stories that sound too crazy to officially report them. Of course, this story could easily be fake, but I found this report to be really interesting. If we believe this story, then it would be a perfect example of a classic ghost encounter. Like I already mentioned, prior to the death, the woman lived a solitary life and didn't really allow anyone to enter her house. If we follow the old belief that some ghosts get attached to earthly locations instead of moving on to the afterlife, then this would explain her hostile demeanor. But what do you think? Is this a real ghost story or just an elaborate hoax? Time slip. Our last report comes from a young police officer from Utah. Towards the beginning of his career, he was patrolling a highway leading through a desert. As with most highways, these patrols mostly consisted of driving in a straight line while the sun is burning you. But since the man was new in the department, such tasks were always given to him. It was rare to encounter anything special during these patrols, but on this particular day, something did happen. At an intersection, he saw a white pickup truck. No one was inside the vehicle, and there were also no traces that indicated that someone had been here recently. He assumed that the vehicle might have a flat tire, or that it was missing gas. Fearing that the owner of the vehicle had continued his way by foot, he wrote down the license plate and entered his cruiser. The officer called in the vehicle and requested any information the station might have had regarding this vehicle. This whole thing took maybe 30 seconds, but when he turned his head, the truck was gone. There had been no sounds, and the truck was nowhere to be seen on any of these roads, despite them being straight lines. To him, it made no sense how he could have missed it if the vehicle had driven off, especially since no one was inside the vehicle when he searched it. But since there was nothing he could do, he got back into his cruiser and continued his duty. However, he was intrigued by this event, and when he returned to the station, he sat down at his computer and began to research this vehicle. The officer basically checked if there were any recent accidents or other events in connection to this car. There was one note. According to this note, this truck had been involved in a car accident in recent years. The photos matched perfectly, and the officer was convinced that he had found his missing vehicle, until he read the report regarding this accident. 5 years prior to him finding this truck, an accident happened right at that intersection. Apparently, the owner of this truck had stopped at exactly the same spot where the officer later spotted the vehicle. Back then, a large semi-truck crashed into this vehicle, and the owner was killed. Photos showed that this white pickup truck had basically been reduced to rubble. It made no sense how he could have encountered that exact same vehicle 5 years later. People who heard that story obviously blamed it on two different supernatural phenomenons. First, some people claim that this is a rare ghost car encounter, which is something that doesn't happen very often and sounds kinda strange. Other people leaned more towards another strange phenomenon, so-called time slips. Time slips are basically a science fiction concept claiming that sometimes random people are either sent back in time or sent forward in time. There are no apparent rules for how this happens, but these time slips usually don't last very long. So upon hearing this story, people who believe in time slips claimed that he had experienced the scene in the state it had been in 5 years ago. But even if we play with this idea, this report doesn't even match those fictional time slips. Because why did the officer only encounter the vehicle, but not the driver, not to mention the semi-truck causing the accident? Either way, this report is rather strange, especially if you experience something like that as a newly recruited officer. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to check out the rest of my channel. There, I have amassed even more creepy stories that sound an awful lot like this one. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.